Baldur's Gate 3 might be the most Astroturf game I've seen since Hi-Fi Rush early this year, where a bunch of shills come on 4chan and are just like, "Aw man, guys, this is one of the best games this year. It's a new IP. It feels like it could have come out in the GameCube days. This is one of the best action games I've ever played. It's fun, it's creative, it's stylish. This is amazing." Couple of weeks later, completely forgotten. Nobody talks about Hi-Fi Rush anymore. Nobody remembers it. Like, people aren't even gonna like be upset when it doesn't get nominated for Game of the Year, right? Like, Hi-Fi Rush is dead, right? It had a really big shilling campaign behind it, but it's dead. And Baldur's Gate 3, all the same signs, right? Lots of inorganic discussion. Lots of streamers are being paid to promote it, and I do have confirmation they are being paid to promote it. There's all this like fake as like all out just like gaslighting gaslighting when it comes to like, oh man, the Metacritic score, it's about as high as Breath of the Wild's, right? um not taking into account that Breath of the Wild is a much more mainstream game with a lot more critic reviews and a lot more like people actively trying to bring the score down, like people like Jim Sterling. Like you have people like trying to make weird comparisons between like the Twitch, like the concurrent players on Steam and stuff like that, which I was actually going to make a video about that, about how that's the new thing now that like people no longer buy into like the Metacritic score, the sales number thing. Like, the new thing to try and pretend your game is like hot and popular is to like pretend it's like it has like a large amount of players on Steam, right? Like, I would not be surprised if Valve is like selling some kind of service in order to like inflate those numbers to artificially just inflate this stuff, right? Because when you actually look at the hard data, right, it doesn't make any sense, right? When you look at like how many units this probably sold, like the number I saw is like 2.5 million, right? That is not on the straight on the same level as something like Elden Ring or even like you know Luigi's Mansion 3. Like there are like so many games that came out this year that is more relevant than this. Like, I made the comparison like when I was talking about this when I first saw it, that like, people are trying to compare this to Tears of the Kingdom. I wouldn't even put this up against Fire Emblem Three Houses. Like, Three Houses is much more socially relevant. It has like way more popular characters. It's iconic. Like, and yeah, Fire Emblem Three Houses is like 4 years old at this point, and it's like trending #1 on Twitter because like Dimitri killed Guts in a death battle, right? Like, that is like real long-standing popularity, right? Fire Emblem is huge. Fire Emblem is like blowing up in popularity. It's maintained its audience for years, and that popularity is extending to like other games in the series, to Nintendo in general, and like even other mediums, right? Like, Fire Emblem is an example of a really popular, successful like an RPG, right? That will have like a dedicated following for years to come, right? Fire Emblem is huge. Baldur's Gate, in comparison, like, this game is like not even like what, like, the full release hasn't even been out for 2 weeks. It already feels like it's running on Steam, because when you it's running out of Steam, because when you actually look at what people are talking about, when you actually look at what the game is, when you actually look at like what it amounts to, like, it's amazing when you actually look at these channels and like look at what they're talking about. Like, oh man, look at the Metacritic score, look at these concurrent players, this is probably going to be game of the year. They're not talking about the game at all, right? Like, if you listen to like any of these commentary channels, like, that's what a lot of these people are saying, is that like, oh man, Nintendo fanboys are going to be upset when Tears of the Kingdom loses game of the year to Baldur's Gate 3. It's so shallow. It's so basic. It's so like empty. It's so hollow. Like, there is not a chance that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to beat Tears of the Kingdom, like, for game of the year, right? Like, we've already seen like the backlash is starting to set in. Like, the cracks are starting to show. People are starting to point out that like the game is too sexually degenerate. Like, the game falls apart after the second act. Like, there's this little tidbit I noticed, is that like they have not officially released hard sales numbers yet. right? Like my estimation, like going by like developer trends and stuff like that, like assuming this sells like 5 million units, like in the first couple of months, like Tears of the Kingdom sold 10 million in its first 3 days, right? Tears of the Kingdom was a much bigger release, you know, from a much bigger franchise on a much more popular piece of hardware, right? Like it seems as if right now we're in this situation where the gaming industry is desperately doing everything they can to control the situation in regards to like how games are viewed and like what gets hype and what's allowed to be hype and what's like it's fascinating, right? Because unfortunately a couple of months ago it was acknowledged that like developers were freaking out over Tears of the Kingdom, right? We saw Twitter threads about this. We saw like we knew what companies they worked for. We knew what these individuals were, who these individuals were. We knew what they did. Like we know that like people were freaking out over Tears of the Kingdom and what it was doing because nothing there is no developer in the industry that is doing anything that what Tears of the Kingdom is doing, right? You know, the bar of quality was so high for Tears of the Kingdom that people were freaking out, right? You know, it was a known phenomenon among the community, right? What happens? 3 months later, journalists try and take that same energy and try to apply it to Baldur's Gate 3. Some developer somewhere is scared that Baldur's Gate 3 is so good, it's gonna make their games look bad. And unlike with Tears of the Kingdom, you don't see any like examples, you don't see any tweets, you don't see specific statements, you don't see like a back and forth, you don't see a dialogue, you don't have like any idea of like what's going on because much like the rest of this situation, it's entirely fake. It is not true in the slightest that people are worried about Baldur's Gate 3. If anything, these developers are going along with Baldur's Gate 3 because this is everything they want gaming to be. You know, just woke, broken, unfinished messes, right? You know, that sells itself entirely on hype with no real quality control or content at all. That leeches off a popular franchise like Dungeons and Dragons without doing anything new, interesting, or innovative like Tears of the Kingdom did. Like that is, people don't want to admit this, but Baldur's Gate 3 is a stereotypical AAA game. All this crap that people are spouting about, like, oh, they don't have DLC. This is a finished product. There's no other developer in the industry that's doing this. Bullshit. Tears of the Kingdom stomps the hell out of this. Like, Tears of the Kingdom is, by itself, like, destroys the entire AAA gaming industry, right? Like, there's just nothing that people can do to argue against that other than like make false equivalences or like make up some nonsense about the Metacritic score or like the player numbers or like the RPG system or like no, like I have no intention of ever playing Baldur's Gate 3. You know, with Elden Ring, I at least considered it because like I was like maybe like, oh yeah, maybe they improved over the Dark Souls formula. You know, maybe it's worth checking out. I will not even glance at Baldur's Gate 3. That shit is getting ignored, okay? Like, I don't care about this game. And I expect the vast majority of the audience does not care either. You know, I have seen too many streamers who are obviously paid playing this game to really, like, take this experience seriously. You know, I have seen too much from this game at this stage to really believe any of the hype. You know, this is something I would put up there with like Devil May Cry 5 or like Elden Ring or like just Witcher 3 as just pure overhyped garbage by people who have never played a Nintendo game in their lives. They have no idea what's actually out there, right? And so they have to limit themselves to like whatever flavor of the month title that gets dropped on Steam. You know, it happened with Hi-Fi Rush, and now it's happening with Baldur's Gate 3. And I would like to take a moment to talk about a game that had a higher Metacritic score than Baldur's Gate 3 that nobody wants to talk about, and that is of course The House in Fata Morgana, a game that like far surpasses Baldur's Gate 3 when it comes to like its storytelling, its visual design, its content. Like I would not be surprised if this if The House of Fata Morgana has more content than Baldur's Gate 3. Like, you know, more like hard hitting, crazy storytelling drama. Like, play The House of Fata Morgana, okay? You won't regret it. Like 100 points on Metacritic when that thing first came out. It is a masterpiece in its genre. Baldur's Gate 3 will never compete with that. Like when people say, like, talk about like the House of Fata Morgana, even today, they look back on that like 100 Metacritic score fondly because that game deserved all the hype it got, right? Baldur's Gate 3 does not. When you get right down to it, there is nothing spectacular about this game.